Hello, this is Kyrasis, and in this Blood Death Knight analysis video, we will be looking at Dragonflight and seeing how this expansion has changed Blood as a specialization, as well as what we might want to see in the future, moving into the War Within expansion. The core of Blood Death Knight's gameplay rotation has largely been left untouched in the Dragonflight expansion. Our core gameplay loop still revolves around runes, runic power, and Deathstrike. Efficiently managing bone shield stacks is still a core gameplay consideration. Deathstrike remains our primary source of mitigation, and we still have all of the same defensive cooldowns that we had in Shadowlands. That being said, while the core gameplay loop is mostly unchanged, we have seen a number of changes in Dragonflight that refined the specialization in a large number of areas. Previously, maintaining threat on more than 5 targets, which is beyond Heartstrike's target range while standing in Death and Decay, has been something of a long-standing issue for Blood Death Knights in Mythic Plus. In Battle for Azeroth, a borrowed power system called Azerite Essences allowed you to take one of several generic on-use abilities, and, for better or worse, Blood Death Knights would be turning down several appealing options just to get an AoE taunt Greater Essence that could remove threat issues on pull once every 2 minutes. Meanwhile, in Shadowlands, the only real counterplay available to these threat issues was the Night Fae Covenant, which provided both a strength buff that affected our uncapped AoE abilities, and a conduit that almost tripled the damage of Death and Decay. In times of desperation with threat issues, some players have even non-ironically tried to use Bone Storm as a solution to these problems, where Bone Storm is a deeply flawed ability that has always competed with high power talents. In Dragonflight, a number of changes occurred in Dragonflight to make this much less of an issue. 1. The new talent Shattering Bone is a new and significant source of consistent uncapped AoE damage, which indirectly made Tombstone a burst uncapped AoE damage ability as well. Number 2, Blood Plague, a source of uncapped AoE damage, now does significantly more damage thanks to the talents Coagulopathy and, to a lesser extent, Rapid Decomposition. Third, we have Death and Decay, which is a much more frequently cast uncapped AoE ability thanks to the previous 3 talents, Sanguine Ground, Unholy Ground, and Death's Echo. So not only are we more encouraged to use Death and Decay than before, but Death's Echo indirectly provides extra cooldown reduction that increases potential Death and Decay throughput. Finally, we have Abomination Limb, which is available as a talent for an uncapped burst AoE damage cooldown. And while it is true that all of these listed items are reliant on taking certain talents, all of the associated talents are almost always used in all content types, given the current state of the talent trees. The main exception being Abomination Limb, which can be dropped for Soul Reaper in situations that heavily emphasize single target damage, such as most raid encounters. And so, as long as you have a few global cooldowns to work with at the start of a pull, and DPS players are not doing anything too unreasonable, threat issues have mostly vanished on large multiple target pulls in Mythic Plus. That being said, the solution to our threat issues came with a few side effects. 1, we are more positionally constrained to sit in our more frequent Death and Decay casts than we were before, since so many benefits are tied to actually standing in the Death and Decay. While it is not necessarily a bad thing to emphasize Death and Decay in the rotation more than it was before, I think it is fair to say that a number of players find that being tied to a ground effect a majority of the time is not an enjoyable gameplay dynamic. Second, all of these new increases in uncapped AoE damage come in the form of abilities that do not scale with haste, which makes haste a less effective damage stat in AoE than it was in previous iterations of the Blood specialization, where the majority of your uncapped AoE damage used to come from Blood Boil itself. On the topic of haste losing some relative value in AoE damage situations in the Dragonflight expansion, we may as well do a quick drive-by on how other secondary stats have been affected, starting with Mastery. The new talents Ironheart and Gloomward provide a combined 38% buff to the effectiveness of Mastery's defensive benefit, making this the most effective Blood's mastery has been since Legion released. Similar to before, both of these talents are almost always taken in competitive talent builds for all content types, with only some small exceptions. Versatility, for its part, has had no new synergies or anti-synergies from Dragonflight changes, while Critical Strike has lost relative defensive value mainly for two reasons. One, new benefits tied to Bone Shield consumption, and two, higher baseline levels of resource regeneration, and we will now talk about both of those in more detail. Bone Shield consumption has been generally undesirable in the history of Blood Death Knights, since generating new Bone Shield charges comes at the cost of more runic power generation, as well as some potential damage output that you could get through Hard Strike. The new talents Insatiable Blade and Shattering Bone have made Bone Shield consumption provide Dancing Rune Weapon cooldown reduction, as well as AoE damage, making Bone Shield consumption a net positive for both offensive and defensive purposes. This has three implications. 1. More Critical Strike means more parry and less Bone Shield consumption. 2. Bone Shield consumption is generally much higher in Mythic Plus than it is in Raid, causing the impact of these benefits to be significantly different depending on the content type you are in. And 3. In Raid, it creates a situation where you would rather be actively tanking something at all times rather than being an inactive off-tank, even if all you care about is damage done. As for our baseline resource regeneration, the new talent Improved Death Strike reduced the baseline minimum Death Strike cost from 40 runic power to 35 runic power if we also factor in Ossuary, while Runic Attenuation, Empowered Rune Weapon, Unholy Ground, and all Dancing Rune Weapon related talents improved baseline RP and rune generation, not to mention a number of benefits directly increasing the healing benefits of each individual Death Strike, such as the aforementioned Blood Shield enhancing talents, Sanguine Ground, and a number of talents we have not talked about yet that increase the uptime of Vampiric Blood. However, I'm going to leave those off of this slide for space reasons. The only real downside with regards to death striking in this expansion is that Heartbreaker and Hemostasis are now in more competitive locations than they were before, so they are not taken as much as they were in Dragonflight, even though you can still pick them up some of the time. Even taking that into account, death strike based mitigation is now at historically high levels. This indirectly increases the defensive power of Mastery, Haste, and Versatility, since all three of those secondary stats scale the effectiveness of Deathstrike healing in a multiplicative fashion. There's also another implication of increased resource levels. Previously, Blood Death Knights have had a certain amount of downtime built into their rotation, where they wouldn't have enough resources to consistently be using abilities all of the time. And you could generally leverage this downtime for better Deathstrike timings. Now, with all of this extra resource regeneration, we are in a state of near zero rotational downtime, where we are constantly casting something. Granted, this indirectly nerfs additional resource regeneration options, since any new resource regeneration is less likely to fill an empty global cooldown, and instead it needs to compete for cast time with existing abilities we also want to use. Blood Tap, for example, used to provide extra runes that would simply increase the amount of heart strikes and death strikes you could use. Nowadays, if we wanted to use Blood Tap, we are generally sacrificing some amount of Blood Boil throughput in order to cast any extra heart strikes and death strikes, which greatly reduce the damage benefit associated with the extra rune regeneration. Also new in Dragonflight are Deathstrike-related stacking maintenance buffs with Coagulopathy and, to a lesser extent, Icy Talons. These require a minimum amount of Deathstrike throughput to keep active at max stacks. That being said, with the current state of runic power generation, both of these buffs can usually be maintained at or near full uptime without paying much attention to them. I hope this never changes, however, because Deathstrike already has enough considerations going on for it that it doesn't really need this sort of buff management as an added consideration. While the exact defensives we are using themselves have not changed at all since Shadowlands, many of them have seen significant baseline improvements. Several talents that enhance and lower the cooldown of Dancing Rune Weapon were added in Dragonflight that were previously given as tier set or legendary effects. These talents greatly increased the overall uptime and damage of Dancing Rune Weapon. Similarly, Red Thirst can now be obtained without losing Purgatory, which also allows for a greatly reduced Vampiric Blood cooldown on top of supporting talents like improved Vampiric Blood and Umbilicus Eternus that can greatly enhance the effective duration for each cast of Vampiric Blood. Even if all three of these Vampiric Blood options are not always taken, Red Thirst alone is a huge improvement. Following a similar pattern, Anti-Magic Barrier significantly decreases the cooldown of Anti-Magic Shell while increasing its effectiveness. Additionally, competitive talent options were added for Icebound Fortitude cooldown reduction and the damage reduction on Lichborn, which were inspired from Shadowlands Conduits. These aren't as impactful as the other talents that we were talking about for the 3 big defensive cooldowns, but they are still worth noting. So, other than Rune Tap no longer being a baseline ability anymore, these other improvements provided a significant increase in our defensive uptime. Before, not having a defensive active was the norm. Now, we have a defensive cooldown rolling most of the time, assuming you have a reasonable talent selection. Historically, Marrend was the only method of generating Bone Shield charges outside of borrowed power features. However, we now have Abomination Limb, Dancing Rune Weapon, and Death's Caress as alternative ways to generate Bone Shield charges as well. This fixed a quality of life issue with Blood Death Knights where we would often need to get into melee range and get hit with melee attacks before we could get our initial Bone Shield active, while also allowing for more efficient Bone Shield generation in general, since we could substitute these abilities in place of Marrend when they are more efficient, which is pretty much always the case for Abomination Limb and Dancing Rune Weapon anyway. The changes to Death's Caress are the most interesting to talk about, since it was given the ability to generate 2 Bone Shield charges at the cost of a 6-second cooldown. This change makes Death's Caress the most rune-efficient generator of Bone Shield charges out of abilities that can be used regularly, since you gain 2 Bone Shield charges for only 1 rune, but it is also a lot more cast time intensive to generate Bone Shield charges in this way. And if you remember the lack of rotational downtime during the Death Strike and resource discussion, this means that we are sacrificing Blood Boil throughput if we use Death's Caress too much. So, in reality, while high usage of Death's Caress over Marrend for a primary Bone Shield generator can improve runic power efficiency a little bit, it is overshadowed by a relatively large loss in damage from the lost rotational Blood Boils. As such, it is mostly relegated to being used as a ranged filler, or to fill very limited moments of natural rotational downtime at the bottom of our ability priority list. Whether intentional or not, this ability landed in a pretty good spot tuning-wise, where it complements Marrend situationally without taking its place. That being said, the 6-second cooldown does constrain the ability of Blood Death Knights to generate initial threat on multiple ranged targets when doing more involved pull setups in something like Mythic Plus. Arguably, this cooldown was unnecessary since Blood Death Knights do not have anything to gain by using it more frequently. Under normal circumstances, it would just make pull setup a lot more convenient if it did not have the cooldown. That being said, when it comes to utility options, the situation is not necessarily better or worse than it was before, it is merely different. Blood Death Knights now have very accessible AoE crowd control options through Blinding Sleet and, if you want to consider it as such, Abomination Limb, as well as 2 charges of Death Grip and an option for a shortened kick cooldown for more single target shutdown in particular. The 2 charges on Death's Advance from Death's Echo has also been very nice mobility-wise. However, this has come at a cost. Previously baseline crowd control options such as Asphyxiate and Gorfine's Grasp are now costly to the point where they are rarely taken outside of Gorfine's Grasp in raid situations. This is compared to the Shadowlands situations where we used to have both of these abilities all of the time for no trade-off. For what it is worth, Wraithwalk is also more difficult to pick up in the main talent tree, though this mostly just affects raid since you never really took it in Mythic Plus before Dragonflight anyway. So while we have gained some amount of utility, it did come at the cost of losing other tools we used to have. And with a growing number of classes that now provide raid buffs, Death Knights remain as a part of a shrinking minority of classes that do not provide any passive benefits to their raid or even just their group, which is particularly a concern in Mythic Plus content, where raid buffs are nowhere near a guarantee. It is arguably an issue in Raid as well, though the existence of fights where Death Grip becomes very important makes that a more complicated argument. Now, let us talk about the talent tree dynamics themselves, starting with the blood-specific tree. I originally drafted up a very in-depth conversation of what is going on in this tree, but it was far too long by the time I was done with it. So instead, I scrapped all of that, and I'm going to try and keep things more concise and at a high level, even if it means I need to oversimplify things a bit. With that in mind, let's take a look at the current blood talent tree dynamics, specifically for Mythic Plus. Exceptionally powerful talents dictate a lot of what we need to take in the blood talent tree, and all things considered, we are mostly left with two situational choices at the end of the day if we're just looking at competitive options. First, we have Rune Tap versus spending that talent point in Heartbreaker. Heartbreaker is just a nice baseline runic power generation increase, especially in AoE, while Rune Tap's value is specifically targeted at making pull setup easier, making large burst damage easier to live, and it reduces your defensive downtime in situations where you'd be vulnerable to straight up dying without a defensive cooldown active. Needless to say, Rune Tap is both harder to use correctly, and the things that it helps with are more relevant at higher key levels in particular. In Season 1 of Dragonflight, the Season 1 tier set gave so much additional rune generation that Rune Tap was performing well across all key levels, because we had a hard time using all of our rune regeneration anyway, but in any other season, you need to be a lot more tactful when you're using it. Second, we have Bloodshot versus Umbilicus Eternus, which is a significant and mostly single target damage increase against a large AoE survivability increase. Depending on the dungeon, one or the other can be more effective at increasing overall key success rates, where Court of Stars is a stereotypical dungeon that is well suited for Bloodshot, and Freehold is a stereotypical dungeon that is well suited towards Umbilicus Eternus. So it generally just comes down to how much of an emphasis is being played on the tank surviving versus other risks that could deplete the key. The raid situation for the talent tree is a lot more open-ended. On the screen, you will see two different versions of the blood talent tree. One that is kind of damage-oriented, and the other is a lot more conservative with regards to personal survivability considerations. There are a spectrum of builds between these 2 points that sacrifice increasingly large amounts of survivability benefits for increasingly small amounts of damage increases. And depending on the specific raid encounter, it is up to the player's discretion to determine what variation provides the best balance of personal damage and personal survivability to help their raid clear the raid faster, with wipe potential taken into consideration. Granted, this sort of trade-off might not be the most exciting thing, but it is what it is. Furthermore, Gorfine's Grasp, Rune Tap, and Tightening Grasp have become utility considerations in raid content, the grip talents just being very useful in grouping multiple enemies, while Rune Tap is good on the raid encounters with highly tuned burst damage. That being said, Blizzard has generally shied away from raid fights that highly emphasize the tank surviving burst damage in recent expansions, so you don't see too many of those nowadays. The general talent tree dynamics are a little more straightforward, and there is no real need to split Mythic Plus and raid considerations. We are encouraged to path into the early portions of each tree for a number of valuable talents. We are encouraged to path down the middle portion of the left and right sides of the tree for some even more impactful talents. And then we have a choice of 3 capstones, where technically you can justify going any combination of them, depending on whether you want resource regeneration and haste, AoE damage and AoE grouping, or raw single target damage throughput. That being said, it is extremely rare for Empowered Rune Weapon to not be taken, so this usually just boils down to a single target versus AoE trade-off between Abomination Limb and Soul Reaper, unless grip utility is the only reason why you are taking Abomination Limb in an otherwise single target fight. Along the way, there's some amount of optionality as to how you path down the tree, and you have a few points left over to spend on what are mostly utility options with a few minor baseline power talents sprinkled in to compete with the pure utility options. So, if we were to consider both talent trees together, I think it is fair to say that we have more choices than what was offered with the pre-Dragonflight talent trees. That being said, there are a number of talents that effectively see no use for blood, regardless of the content type. The talents I have circled in red are basically never taken, while the ones in orange are only used in fringe cases. Most of these red and orange talents are innately unappealing, with Wraithwalk and Blood Drinker maybe being the only exceptions where pathing considerations play a respectable role in them not being used as much as they could be. Additionally, I'd like to highlight talents that do get taken for pathing, but they are especially weak on their own. Enfeeble is a very tepid, sporadic, and unsatisfying type of damage reduction benefit. Relish in Blood, as well as Perseverance of the Ebon Blade, are relics from a time where we used to play around Crimson Scourge procs. However, due to how many benefits we have built into Death and Decay, as well as the fact that we have near zero rotational downtime, it is not something that we are going to do in the current state of the game. Heartrend and Tightening Grasp would likely never be taken if it were not for the fact that you want Purgatory in most situations and you are willing to spend an extra talent point to get it. That being said, they add nothing interesting on their own. So if anyone from Blizzard wants to try out completely new or modified talent nodes, these circled talents are a good place to start. No one will miss them. I'm not going to comment much on structural changes here because that is too much of a creative exercise, but I do want to provide some feedback on the implications of the current structure, as well as the strong talents that force pathing. First, the general talent tree has a respectable amount of flexibility outside of trying to talent Wraithwalk. You could put in a new and appealing talent anywhere else into that tree, and you would have a reasonable means of grabbing it. While if you put something in Wraithwalk's position, it would need to be strong enough to justify cuts of valuable talents elsewhere. The Blood tree, on the other hand, is a lot more constrained, where it is particularly painful to path to the highlighted locations. Freeing up an extra talent point or two in the middle of the talent tree would go a long way towards removing excess pathing costs from both of these locations. Otherwise, similar to Wraithwalk's location, a talent would need to be sufficiently strong in any of these positions to get the players to swap tracks. Altogether, the Dragonflight expansion really did a lot to refine the existing Blood Death Knight kit, between enhancing uncapped AoE damage to solve threat issues, stronger blood shields, improving baseline resource regeneration that practically removed rotational downtime, drastically empower the effectiveness of our defensive cooldown kit. It added several alternate ways to generate bone shield beyond Morrowind. It gave additional benefits to bone shield consumption. It added death strike maintenance buffs, and it made standing in Death and Decay a lot more impactful. Crowd control and utility are perhaps slightly better, but not significantly different than what we had in Shadowlands between new additions and previously baseline utility that is now harder to get. The Blood talent tree doesn't have too many real options when it comes to Mythic Plus content, but it isn't 100% set in stone, while Raid has more a flexible dynamic involving how greedy for personal damage you want to make your build in the face of steeper and steeper survivability hits, which technically involves a larger range of potential swaps, even though the swaps you're making are not particularly exciting. Raid also has some utility pickups baked into the Blood tree as well, while the general tree has slightly more flexibility for utility pickups in all content types, and technically has capstones that are somewhat interchangeable depending on the solution. So, what about my personal opinions on Blood Death Knights in Dragonflight? I do think that the core Blood Death Knight gameplay loop was greatly enhanced by the changes we saw in Dragonflight, even if none of the changes were particularly flashy or new. If I had one main piece of feedback to provide, it would be related to Death Knight utility, both relating to Blood itself as well as the class as a whole. 1. Death Knights still lack any sort of passive performance-enhancing group or raid buff. While Death Grips kind of serve as a differentiating function in raid, this is not the case for Mythic Plus content, where you're only able to get a fraction of full raid buffs at any given time. 2. Even if we were focusing on grip utility and raid, the Blood spec has a competitive advantage on grip utility over Unholy and Frost due to having the ability to pick up Gorfiend's Grasp and raids, in addition to having half of the effective cooldown on Death Grip. Blood's anti-magic zone also has a much higher cap than what we see on Unholy and Frost, so it is just a strange dynamic where when the only raid utility provided by Death Knights is just provided better by Blood than the other DPS specs. 3, should Vengeance Demon Hunters remain in their current state, Blood Death Knights, as well as a number of other tank specializations, just have nothing even closely comparable to the amount of AoE crowd control being provided by Vengeance Demon Hunters, in addition to Blood's lack of other ways to interact with their group and their lack of raid or group buffs. Part of the solution is probably going to be nerfing Vengeance Demon Hunters, but part of it could also be raising the utility that is provided baseline from Blood and some of the other tanks. Second, this may seem like a small thing, but I think removing the cooldown from Death's Caress would be a nice quality of life change. We would not use Death's Caress any more frequently in our normal rotation anyway, but it gives us more to work with during pull setup. The 6-second cooldown is just a little constraining at times. 40-yard range would also be nice to pull things from further away, but I understand I'm probably reaching with that one. Next, Death and Decay and all of its related benefits between more haste, more damage, and being able to cleave multiple enemies, and having Shattering Bone do triple its normal damage. I'm going to propose that some or all of these benefits just be provided to the player in the form of a 10-second buff on casting Death and Decay, one that stays on the character regardless of whether or not you're standing in it. There remains a soft incentive to keep enemies in the Death and Decay, so they're at least taking the ticking damage, but we would no longer be handicapped as much by having to move out of it, which would also hold true for the DPS specs. And it would also just give the player more freedom to use it as a snare when Grip of the Dead is talented as appropriate. Next, I already provided my talent tree feedback earlier, though I do think there are a lot of talents that are good candidates for reworks, and that the middle of the blood tree could use slightly more freedom of movement in one form or another. The talent trees have a lot of complicated dynamics and have a lot of room for creative solutions should someone want to take things in that direction. Next, the Deathstrike maintenance buffs could be problematic with different tuning, so I'm somewhat skeptical about these mechanics existing at all, but it isn't a big deal with how things are currently tuned. Also, while this isn't my own feedback, I do know that there are some people who are not a huge fan of the Bone Shield consumption benefits dynamic, specifically for those focused in raid, while other players just think Blood Death Knights largely play the same since they have in Legion, and that they could use some freshening up to keep things just more interesting. All things considered, Blood is a relatively popular tank specialization, so I understand why some people may be hesitant to rock the boat too much on how it plays, but I do think things getting a bit stale is a fair critique. But let me know what your thoughts are about the direction of Blood in the comments below, and if there's anything in particular you'd like to see changed with the specialization. As always, feel free to stop by the channel Discord if you want to talk about Blood Death Knight theory crafting, general Mythic Plus questions, and if you would like a Mythic Plus log review. The channel Discord information, as well as my personal Discord contact information, is in the video description below. And if you want to make it easier for other people to find this content, feel free to upvote the video and subscribe to the channel. In the meantime, good luck and have fun.